The northern sky went white, and out of that white a woman walked, alone, into a blizzard that had already killed stronger travelers. 11 days behind her. Nothing ahead but ice and a folded letter she wasn't sure she believed. Below the pass, a valley waited, smoke rising from a stone hall, a creek frozen still, a king who lived alone and had buried what he loved. He did not yet know she was coming. He would. And far to the south, on a road she thought she'd escaped, hoofs struck frozen ground in a slow, certain rhythm. A dark coat. Silver at the temples. A man who did not hurry, because men like him never had to. He had already buried 2 young women the world agreed to forget. He was coming to bury a third. She stopped at the ridge. The wind tore at her. And down in the red snow below, something enormous was bleeding. The snow came sideways that morning, and Wren Holloway walked into it with her chin up, because there was nobody left in Highreach who deserved to see her lower it. 11 days. That was how long the road behind her had been. 11 days of frozen ground and borrowed shadows, of sleeping in the hollows of dead trees and rationing bread that had gone hard as stone, of drinking snow melted in her cupped hands, because a fire would have been a beacon, and a beacon would have been the end of her. 11 days of listening, always listening, for hooves on the road behind. But the road behind her had started earlier than 11 days. It had started in the great hall of her own pack, in front of 200 faces she had known her whole life, on the morning they decided she was a thing to be sold. She was 22 years old. She remembered thinking that, oddly, in the middle of it, the way the mind reaches for a small true fact when the large facts become unbearable. 22. Old enough to be sold, young enough to be told it was for her own good. She stood on the cold flagstones of the hall, where she had been named, as an infant, in the pale gray light that came through the high windows, and she listened to her own father read the terms of her sale out loud like a man reading a receipt at market. Torrance Holloway had a voice built for public occasions. Deep, unhurried, warm at the edges in a way that had fooled better people than his daughter. He stood at the head of the hall in his good gray coat, the one he kept for funerals and bargains, and he told the assembled pack that the debts of the Holloway line had grown too heavy to carry alone, debts he had spent 7 patient years building. The way some men built cathedrals, with devotion and stubbornness, and a complete absence of good judgment. And he told them that Lord Damaris Vale, generous Lord Damaris, patient Lord Damaris of the great house 4 days to the south, had agreed to forgive every coin of it. In exchange for one thing. Her. Wren stood very still while he said it. She had learned long ago that stillness was the one dignity nobody could take from you by force. It had to be surrendered, and she had stopped surrendering it years back. Around her the pack shifted and murmured, and she felt their eyes move over her the way you would assess livestock at a fair. The too-thin frame, that 11 days of hardship still lay in her future to earn, the omega cent that marked her low in every ranking. That mattered to wolves, the plainness that had always made her easy to overlook and easier to blame. She was the daughter nobody had ever quite known what to do with. Too quiet to be charming. Too watchful to be comfortable. A girl who noticed things in a house where noticing was dangerous. Useless little thing, someone said behind her, not troubling to lower their voice. At least she's finally good for something. She did not turn around. She fixed her eyes on the far window, where the winter light came in gray and honest, and she let them talk. She had spent a lifetime being talked about in rooms she was standing in. She had learned to let the words pass through her like cold water, through a net. You did not try to hold them. You only made sure they did not hold you. Because she had a secret, and the secret was this: she had already decided to run. They thought the humiliation would break her. That was the part they always got wrong about her, every one of them, her whole life. They thought that standing her up in front of 200 people and pricing her like grain would grind the last of the fight out of a girl everyone agreed had never had much fight to begin with. But Wren had spent 22 years being underestimated, and she had learned to wear it the way other people wore a coat, something to hide inside of, something to keep the cold off, something to shrug out of at exactly the moment they had all stopped watching for it. They were watching her look defeated. She let them. Underneath the coat, she was already gone. Her father finished reading. He rolled the parchment closed, with the small satisfied gesture of a man concluding good business. And then, because Torrance Holloway could never in his life resist an audience, he crossed the hall to where his daughter stood, and he took her face in one hand, not gently, and turned it toward the light so that everyone assembled could see the goods. "You'll thank me," he said, low, just for her, under the cover of the pack's murmur. "Vale forgives a 7-year debt. And all it costs is a daughter who is never going to amount to anything anyway." His grip tightened on her jaw. She felt the old familiar flare of it, the pressure that had, more than once across the years, left marks she'd had to explain away, with lies she got better at telling every season. There was a bruise already blooming beneath her left eye, that morning, yellowing at the edges, from the night before, from the conversation, where she had first said the word no out loud and learned, again, what that word cost in her father's house. She let him hold her face. She let 200 people watch him do it. And she memorized every one of them. Not out of hatred. Out of a colder, more useful thing. She wanted to remember, later, in whatever life came, after this one, exactly who had watched a man crush his daughter's jaw in a public hall and found in themselves nothing to say. Then she did the only thing she had left to do in that room. Her father had sent her a betrothal token from Lord Damaris the week before, a collar of dark silver, cold and heavy, worked to look like a jewel, and weighted like a chain, which was, she had thought, when it arrived, an unusually honest piece of craftsmanship. It hung at her throat that morning because he had ordered her to wear it, so that the pack could see the bargain sealed. Wren reached up, in front of everyone, and unclasped it. The hall went quiet. Not all at once, quiet moved through it in a wave, from the front, where they could see her hands, to the back, where they only sensed the change. She held the collar out flat on her open palm for a long moment, letting the gray light catch the silver, letting every soul in that hall get a good look at the price of her. And then she simply opened her fingers and let it fall. It hit the flagstones with a small, final sound, not loud, almost nothing at all, and skittered across the cold stone to a stop against her father's boot. "Keep the debt," she said. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced this in the dark night after night until it wouldn't. "I would rather owe the whole world than owe that man one night." The gasp that went through the hall was worth more to her than anything she had ever owned. Her father's face changed. She watched the public warmth drain out of it the way it always did behind closed doors, watched the real man surface underneath the good gray coat, and she knew, with the certainty of a girl who had read this exact weather her entire life, that if she stayed in that room one moment longer, he would show her again, in front of everyone, or in some quiet corner after, precisely what his hands were for. So she did not stay. She turned. And she walked the length of the great hall of Highreach, with her spine straight and her ruined eye held high, past every face that had watched her father put a price on her head, past the murmurers and the pitying and the merely curious. And she pushed open the tall doors with both hands, and she stepped out into the snow. And she did not look back. Not once. Looking back was for people who still believed there was something behind them worth turning around for. There had been one kindness. There is always, if you're very lucky, exactly one. An old Omega named Maeve lived at the ragged edge of the Holloway lands, in a low stone cottage half the pack had forgotten was even inhabited, and she had watched Wren grow up, from behind her frost-glazed window, with the particular attentiveness of someone who sees everything and says nothing until the precise moment saying something will matter. She had lost a daughter of her own, once, long ago, in a way nobody spoke of, and she had never afterward been able to look at a bruised girl and feel nothing. On the morning Wren ran, Maeve was waiting on the path in the falling snow, wrapped in a shawl gone thin, with years, and at her feet sat a satchel already packed. Hard bread. Dried meat wrapped in waxed cloth. A flint and a small striker. A wool cloak thicker and warmer than anything Wren had ever been permitted to own. And, pressed down into the very bottom, where no searcher would think to reach, a small purse of coins that Maeve could not possibly have afforded to give away. Maeve did not say much. She was not a woman who wasted words when silence would carry the same freight. She took Ren's bruised face in both her weathered hands, carefully, so carefully, the way you cup water you are afraid of spilling, the same way Ren's own mother had held her face before the fever took her all those years ago. And she looked at her for a long moment the way you look at someone you are trying to memorize, because you do not expect to see them again. "There is a king in the north," Maeve said at last. "Cale Thorne, Alpha of Ashmore, out past the high pass, at the cold edge of the world. They say he is hard." She paused, and something dry and knowing moved through her old eyes. They say a great many things about men who choose to live alone. Most of them are said by people who could not survive 1 week the way those men survive a lifetime. I would not put too much stock in what they say. She pressed a folded packet into Ren's hand. 3 letters, sealed and worn soft at the creases from handling, and beneath them a single sheet with an address written on it in a careful hand, an address at the very far edge of everything. "He put out word, some months back, that he was looking for a mate," Maeve went on. "Wrote it plain and honest, which is rarer than you would think. No boasting. No pretty lies about himself. I answered it in your name, child. Forgive me that liberty. I have been answering it slowly for a while now, a little at a time, because I could not send you walking into the snow toward nothing at all. A woman needs a direction, even when she is only running away from one." Ren looked down at the letters in her hand. 3 of them. She unfolded the top one, with numb fingers, and read a few lines, careful, formal, almost stiff, the writing of a man, who said exactly what he meant, and then stopped, who mentioned somewhere in the second paragraph, without decoration or performance, that his mate had died 3.5 years past. Stated it plainly. Set it down like a fact she was owed, before deciding anything, rather than a wound displayed to win her pity. She had not written the answers herself. Maeve had done that. But she understood, standing there in the falling snow, with the cold paper in her fist, that some part of her had already agreed to walk toward that far address anyway, that she had been walking toward it, secretly, in the back rooms of her own mind, for longer than she would ever admit. "Why would a king want me?" she asked. It came out smaller than she intended. It was the first thing she had said all morning that let the fear show through. Maeve's old eyes did not soften into pity. If anything, they sharpened, went bright and hard, as a blade held up to check its edge. "Child," she said, "the day you finally understand that the wanting was never the point, that is the day you stop being anyone's to sell." She held Ren's gaze until she was sure the words had landed somewhere they would keep. Then she turned, and she pointed north toward the pass, toward the white teeth of the mountains, toward the cold, unknown edge of the map. And Ren walked. The mountains did not care that she was running. This is a thing the wilderness teaches you very fast. If it does not kill you first, it does not care, and its not caring is the most honest thing you will ever meet. There is no cruelty in a blizzard. Cruelty requires a will, an intention, a person on the other side of it choosing your suffering. The mountain chooses nothing. It simply is cold and vast and indifferent, and it will take everything you have and never once notice it took it. After a lifetime of her father's very deliberate, very personal cruelty, Ren found the mountain's indifference almost restful. At least it wasn't aimed at her. For 8 days she climbed, and the weather held, gray and bitter, but passable. On the 9th, the blizzard found her. It came down out of the high pass like a living thing, with a will of its own, white and screaming, and it took the trail, from her first, and then it took the sky, and then it took away even the difference between up and down, until she was crawling on hands and knees through a world made entirely of wind, and white with no floor, and no ceiling, and no direction that meant anything. Her fingers went past cold into something worse, something that stopped hurting, which is the part that should frighten you, and she knew it should frighten her. Some cool, clear part of her mind that had never in her whole life stopped working, not even at the worst of it, knew that when the pain stops, the dying has already started. So she made herself think. Not panic. Think. Panic was a luxury for people who had someone coming to save them. No one was coming for Wren Holloway. There had never once, in 22 years, been anyone coming. She had only ever had herself and her own quiet mind, and the things she had learned by paying attention in a house where paying attention was the only edge she owned. She had been the useless one, the little Omega, good for nothing. But nobody in Highreach had ever noticed the girl who used to slip away, as a child, to sit for hours with the old pack healer in her herb-hung room, the woman everyone else avoided as strange. Nobody had noticed the girl learning which barks brought a fever down and which mosses would stop a wound from bleeding, learning how a body loses its warmth and in exactly what order it loses it, learning the slow patient arts that no one thought worth teaching a daughter meant for marriage. Nobody had noticed because nobody had ever once thought to look at Wren Holloway and wonder what might be going on behind her watchful, quiet face. Her invisibility, which had been a wound bleeding slowly her whole life, was about to become the one and only thing that kept her alive. She stopped fighting the wind and started reading it, feeling which way it drove hardest, understanding that where it drove hardest the snow packed instead of drifting. She found the lee side of a great fallen pine, a giant brought down in some old storm, where the snow had packed firm as a wall instead of piling loose and deep. And she dug. Not down, down was a grave, but in sideways, a hollow just large enough for one curled body, the way a fox or a hare would do it. She lined the floor of it with her own thick cloak, and with pine boughs she snapped off by feel in the screaming dark. She curled herself small, small as she could make herself, minimizing every inch of surface the cold could find, and she breathed slow and deliberate into her own cupped hands, sending the warm air back against her chest, keeping the heat circling instead of letting it fly off into the storm. She did not cry. She had made herself a promise years ago, in the cold of her father's house, that she would never again cry anywhere the cold could use her tears against her. Tears froze. Tears were water the body could not spare. Grief was a fire you could not afford to light when you were trying to keep from freezing. She survived the 9th night, and the 10th. And on the morning of the 11th, when the storm finally exhausted its own fury, and the world came grinding back into being, blinding, silent, and so brutally beautiful it made her eyes ache, Wren Holloway crawled out of her hollow in the snow half dead, and entirely, ferociously alive, and she stood up on shaking legs in a valley she had never seen, under a sky, so wide and so pitiless and so open that it felt less like a view and more like an accusation. She had made it. Against every reasonable expectation, against the mountain and the cold and the odds and the whole weight of everyone who had ever told her she was nothing, she had made it all the way. That was when she heard it. Below her, down the white slope, in a patch of snow that was not white at all. A wolf. Enormous. Bleeding. And dying. She should have run the other way. Every instinct that had kept her alive across 11 impossible days told her to run. An injured alpha in his shifted form was the single most dangerous creature in the whole northern world, a thing of pure pain and cornered power, as likely to tear apart the hand that reached for it as any threat. And this one was vast beyond anything she had ever seen or imagined. Bigger than a horse. Black as the space between the stars, so black the sunlight seemed to fall into his coat and not come back out. There was a long pale scar along his muzzle, old and healed, that spoke of some earlier violence he had already survived once. He had stepped into one of the great iron jaw traps the border poachers set for bounty on exactly such animals, and it had closed on his foreleg above the paw and would not open, and he had fought it with everything a creature that size had to give, until all the snow around him for 10 feet in every direction was the deep, terrible red of a slaughter. He saw her. His huge head came up, slow with pain, and his eyes found her, gray, storm gray, the exact gray of the sky in the last moment, before a storm breaks, when there is still light trapped underneath it, and they fixed on her, with the flat, terrible, narrowing focus of a wounded creature deciding whether the small warm thing at the edge of the clearing was a threat, or prey, or simply the next pain coming. Wren stood at the edge of the trees and did not move. And then she would turn this moment over 1,000 times in the years that came after, in the safe, warm dark, and never once be able to fully explain to herself why she did it. She did the thing that made no sense at all. She did not run. She raised both her hands, slowly, palms turned out and open and empty, held where he could see them plainly. The way you would to a frightened animal. The way, she realized much later, and all at once, no living soul had ever thought to do for her. "I am not going to hurt you," she said, to a wolf the size of a horse, who could open her, from throat to hip, with one lazy motion of his jaws. Her voice came out steady, and she was distantly amazed by that. "But that trap is going to. So you're going to have to decide, right now, whether you would rather die out here proud, or live to be annoyed about it later." The great head lowered a fraction. It might have meant nothing. She chose to believe it meant everything. She crossed the red snow toward him one slow, deliberate step at a time, talking the whole way. Nonsense, gentle, useless nonsense, the low murmuring tone the old healer had used on wounded, frightened things when Wren was small enough to sit in the corner and watch and learn. And she knelt down in the bloody snow beside a dying king and put her small, clever hands directly on the cold iron that was killing him. The trap was old and vicious, and it had been set by someone who wanted the animal to suffer along, while before it died, the release mechanism deliberately stiff, half-rusted, hidden under the jaw. But Wren had spent her whole life finding the hidden mechanism in things, finding the one place where the thing that seemed immovable could be made to give. She found the release by feel, the way she found everything, working her frozen fingers into the mechanism, and she kept talking to him the entire time, low and steady, and the great wolf watched her, with those storm-gray eyes, from inches away, and did not, in all that time, so much as show her a tooth. "There," she breathed. "There it is. Hold still now. Hold still, you great stubborn thing." The rusted jaws sprang. The mangled leg came free, and in that exact instant, as the trap released, her bare frozen hand slid across the fur of his freed foreleg, skin to warmth, her small palm laid flat against the enormous, slow drum of his pulse, and something went through Wren Holloway that she had no word for and would spend a long time trying to find one. It was not warmth, exactly, though there was warmth in it. It was recognition. It was the whole of her, every jangled, screaming, exhausted part of her, going suddenly and impossibly quiet, the way a house goes quiet when a door that has been banging open and shut in a cold draft for years is finally, gently, firmly closed. She felt it travel up the bones of her arm and settle in behind her breastbone and simply stay there, warm and certain, as though it had always meant to live there and had only been waiting for the door to open. And across from her, so close she could feel his breath, the enormous wolf went rigid all over, and a sound came out of him she had never heard any animal make in her life, low and astonished and almost unbearably human. His scent found her in the same heartbeat. Cedar and cold, clean stone, and something underneath both of those that her whole body seemed to have been waiting her entire life to breathe in, without ever once knowing it was waiting. And she knew, without any idea in the world how she knew it, that he was scenting something on her too. Something that had, in the space of a single touch, changed everything. Something neither of them had asked for, and neither of them could ever now take back. She snatched her hand away, as though the fur had burned her. Her heart did a thing it had absolutely no business doing at this particular moment, kneeling in bloody snow beside a wounded predator, and she told it very firmly to stop, and it did not stop, and she understood, with a sinking, soaring certainty that it was not going to. The wolf heaved himself up, onto 3 legs, swaying, the ruined fourth held clear of the ground. And then, in front of her, in a shimmer of the winter air like heat rising off summer stone, he changed, and where the vast black wolf had been there was a man. Tall, so tall that even wounded, even half-crouched, over his injured leg, he seemed to take up half the enormous sky. Dark hair. That same pale scar, running now along a hard human jaw. and those same storm gray eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read at all, could not begin to read, though reading the expressions of powerful men had been the central study of her whole survival. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Steam rose off both of them into the freezing air. "You," the man said finally. His voice was low and rough at the edges, like good leather worked hard in bad weather. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he does not understand and urgently needs to. "You should have run." "I know," Ren said. "You freed a poacher's trap most grown men couldn't work loose." "I know that too." He studied her, the yellowing bruise beneath her eye, the frozen cracked hands, the too thin frame swallowed up in a stolen cloak, the omega scent that announced to the whole world that she was nothing and nobody, and the other thing underneath it, the thing his flaring nostrils had just found, that said something else entirely. Something crossed his weathered face. Not softness. Something more careful and more guarded than softness. "You shouldn't be this strong," Cale Thorne said. It was not an accusation. It landed, strangely, almost like grief, like a man recognizing in a stranger a thing he had thought he was the only one left carrying. Ren looked at the king she had just pulled back from death, standing there bleeding in the snow, and she felt the old fear rise up in her the way it always rose around powerful men, the reflexive calculation of angles, of distances, of where the exits were, and how fast she could reach them, and she waited, braced, for him to become the thing that all of them, sooner or later, became. He didn't. He got to his feet, swaying on his ruined leg, and he did the thing again. Deliberately. He raised his hands. Both of them. Palms out, open, empty. So that she could see them. And Ren Holloway, who had never once in her 22 years had a man show her his hands first, felt something she had walled off long ago crack quietly, dangerously open in the very center of her chest. Ashmore sat cupped in a high fold of the northern mountains like something that had grown up out of the ground there rather than been built upon it. A long low hall of weathered dark stone, smoke rising honest and gray from the chimneys into the white sky. And below the hall, sheltered from the worst of the wind, a small valley that stayed improbably green even in the deep of the cold, where a creek ran clear and quick under a stand of bare gray cottonwoods. It was not grand, the way Ren had spent 11 days half expecting a king's seat to be grand. It was kept. That was the word that came to her, riding in behind Cale, as the light began to fail. Everything about the place had the particular quiet order of a home tended carefully by someone who took care of what was his precisely, because it was all he had, and he knew exactly what it was to have nothing. He had brought her the last miles on the back of a patient old bay mare, walking beside the horse himself the whole way on his wounded leg rather than ride, while she was still half frozen. He had not asked her name until they were nearly to the gate. "Ren," she had told him then, her voice rusty, with cold and disuse. "Ren Holloway." He had said nothing for a long moment, turning it over. Then, "Maeve's letters. You're the one from the south." "I didn't write them," she said. Honesty seemed suddenly, fiercely important. She was so tired of a world built entirely of lies that she could not bear to start this, whatever this was, with even a small one. "An old woman wrote them, in my name, to give me somewhere to point myself." "I know," Cale said. The hand in the third letter shook. An old woman's hand. He glanced at her sidelong, from under the brim of his hat. "But you came anyway. You walked 11 days through that. That part was yours." She had no answer for that at all, because it was true, and because she had not admitted it in those plain words even to herself, until he stood there in the snow and said it out loud for her. Inside, the great hall was dim and blessedly warm after the white glare of the snow. There were people, not many, but real, living unhurried. A broad-shouldered older man named Elder Bran, who had been a scholar somewhere in the wider world for 20 years before he came north and became the keeper of Ashmore's law, and who took one long look at the yellowing bruise beneath Ren's eye, and then, deliberately and kindly, looked away, the way a decent man looks away, from a wound he fully intends to ask about later, gently, when the wounded thing is warm and fed and less afraid. There was a fire in a great stone hearth. There was the smell of something cooking. And Ren stood in the middle of all of it, dripping and shaking, not quite able to make herself believe that any of it was real, or that if it was real it could possibly be for her. Kale showed her to a room. It was small. A bed with a plain pine frame. A quilt that had clearly once been bright and colorful and was now a soft, faded memory of colors, worn thin and kind with washing. A single window that looked north toward the creek and the bare cottonwoods. It was clean, but not company clean. Not someone important is coming, and I must impress them clean. It was clean in the deep, quiet way of a place where things are cared for, because caring for them is a form of respect for the life you have been given, even a hard one. And on the inside of the door, brand new, the iron hardware still bright and unweathered against the old dark wood, a lock. Ren went very still. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him, standing back in the doorway, not coming in. I put it in a little over 2 weeks ago, Kale said. No preamble. No apology. Just the fact, and the reason for it, set down plainly side by side, the way she would come to understand he set down everything. When the last letter said someone was coming, I figured whoever she turned out to be might want a door that locked. And I figured she might want to be the one holding the only key. He reached into his shirt and set something on the top of the dresser, just inside the door, within her reach. A single iron key, small and plain and cold. Then he stepped back and away and clear out of the room entirely, before she could come near enough to make her fetch it from his hand. That's the only one, he said. I didn't make a copy for myself. There's no reason you'd have to take my word for that, so I'm telling you now so you can watch, over time, whether it stays true. Ren crossed the small room. She picked up the key. It was cold and light in her palm, and it weighed almost nothing at all, and at the same time it weighed more than anything she had ever in her life been given to hold. You could have just told me the room was mine, she said. Her voice was not quite steady now. That would have been easier. Words are easy. He said it, without any judgment in it at all, as flatly as a man stating the weight of a stone. A lock is a fact. She looked up at him. He was still out in the doorway, both his hands still visible, making no move at all to come 1 inch farther in, and she understood, slowly, with a strange turning, over sensation deep in her chest, that this was a deliberate choice he was making, moment by moment, and not an accident of where he happened to be standing. He was showing her, without a single word about it, exactly where the boundary lay. He was doing it by standing on the far side of it, in the cold hall, when the fire was in the room. Why are you being so careful? She asked. And then, hearing how it might land, I don't mean, that came out wrong. It's a fair question. He considered it, the way she was already beginning to see he considered everything, turning it slowly to find the true face of it, before he spoke. Because you flinched, back in the clearing, when I stood up too fast. And because there's a mark under your eye that somebody's hand put there, and I know the shape of it. His jaw tightened, not at her, she understood, but at something 1,000 miles to the south. I've seen that particular shape before, more than once. And I learned a long time ago that not everything that looks like a woman being difficult, he said, very quietly, is a woman being difficult. The room was very quiet. The fire ticked in the hearth. My father, Ren said. Then she stopped. Then she started again, more steadily. He had a way of explaining things to me. I imagine he did. He explained them with his hands, mostly. Kale Thorne stood in the doorway and said nothing at all for a moment, and the not saying was its own kind of speech, louder than words. When he spoke again, his voice stayed level, but there was something underneath the level that was not level at all, something banked and dangerous, and a woman who had spent her entire life learning to read the weather underneath the voices of powerful men recognized it instantly. Recognized it, and for the very first time was not afraid of it, because for once in her life it was not pointed at her. The bruise, he said. Not a question. The last explanation. She looked down at the key in her hand. I left that same night. Good. He said the single word low, but with a precision that made it carry the whole weight of a verdict handed down. I'm glad you left. She closed her fingers tight around the key. You'll hear talk, he said, after a moment, about what I am. The cold king out past the pass. Some of it's earned, and I won't stand here and pretend it isn't. He nodded once, toward the room, toward the new lock, toward her. But there is nothing in this hall that is yours to be afraid of. And if you want to leave in the morning, I'll saddle the mare and walk you back over the pass myself and see you safe to wherever you decide to go next. The room is yours tonight either way, whatever you decide. That doesn't cost you anything. It isn't conditional on one single thing. Not conditional on one single thing. She turned the phrase over and over. Men she had known her entire life had never once handed her a sentence without a hook buried somewhere inside it. Never an offer that was not also, secretly, a bill. And here was a king, a stranger, a man who could have simply taken whatever he wanted, telling her plainly that her safety came with nothing owed against it. She did not have words for what that did to something long frozen inside her. So she said the only entirely true thing she had. Thank you. He nodded once, not like it was nothing, but like he understood exactly how much those two small words had cost a woman like her to say, and was accepting the whole weight of them without making her explain a thing. Sleep, Ren Holloway, he said. You've come a very long way. And he pulled the door closed from the outside and left her alone in the small warm room with a lock and a key and the first real quiet she had felt in 11 days, in far longer than 11 days, if she was honest. Ren stood with her back pressed against the closed door in the dark for a long, long time. Then she turned the key in the lock, slowly, and listened to the sound it made. And the sound was nothing at all like a silver collar hitting cold flagstones. It was quieter than that. Softer. More final in a good way, more like a door that has stood banging open in a bitter wind for years, and years finally, gently, coming to rest in its frame. She lay down on the faded quilt, without even undressing, the small key still closed tight in her fist, and she slept the way the dead sleep, or the way the newly, barely, miraculously living sleep, which from the outside can look very much the same. She did not know, that first night, several things. She did not know that the scar along Cale Thorne's jaw had been given to him at 12 years old, when he went alone into a burning barn, after the horses trapped inside, that he had pulled 2 of the 3 out, through the smoke and the falling timber, and had not been able to reach the 3rd, and had carried both of those facts, the 2 he saved, and the one he couldn't, every single day of his life since. She did not know that carrying what you could not save right alongside what you could was a shape her own soul already knew by heart, in its own register, the shape of every wounded thing she'd healed, and every one she'd been too late for, and that it would be some weeks. Yet before the 2 of them found the words to say, that to each other by a low fire. She did not know that the mate Cale had buried 3.5 years before, a sharp-tongued, iron-willed, wickedly funny woman named Rosalind, taken by a fever that came roaring back after everyone, including her, had believed it beaten, had been the last living soul to make the great hall of Ashmore feel like it was the right size. She did not know that a house grown too large for one grieving man had been closing slowly in on Cale Thorne, inch by inch, season by season, for 3 long years, until a half-frozen Omega, with clever hands and a ruined eye, and a spine of cold iron had walked up out of a blizzard and, without the first idea she was doing it, made all the rooms feel the right size again. And she did not know, could not possibly have known, sleeping there with the key clenched in her fist, and the firelight fading in the hearth, that far to the south, in his great cold house, Lord Damaris Vale had already been told that his purchased bride had thrown his silver collar down on a public hall's flagstones in front of 200 witnesses and walked out into the snow. She did not know that Damaris Vale was a patient man, a thorough man, and that patient, thorough men do not forgive being refused in front of 200 witnesses. They do not rage. They do not chase. They plan, quietly, meticulously, for as long as it takes. She did not know that this was the second time a frightened young woman had run from Damaris Vale, or that the first 2 had not run nearly far enough. Their names had been Audley and Kasha, and in a locked drawer of an old dresser, in a storeroom of the very hall, where Ren Holloway now slept, a dead woman's journal had been waiting for 3 long years in the dark to finally say so. Part 2. The threat came in the night, and by the time the morning fire was lit, the whole of Ashmore knew. That was the first thing Wren learned about living among a pack. Nothing stayed secret for long. A folded paper pushed under the outer gate. Before dawn was, by the time the porridge pot was steaming over the flames, a thing that every single soul in the valley had already formed a firm opinion about. And the opinions she discovered as she came out into the hall that first gray morning were not all of them kind. She had expected that. A woman learns to expect that early, or she does not survive being a woman for very long. What she had not expected, what she had no armor prepared for, was how it would feel to stand in a warm, safe hall for the first time in her life, and hear the low murmur move around her like weather moving across a valley. The sidelong glances that slid away when she turned toward them. The way a conversation would drop half a step in its rhythm when she passed near it and then resume too smoothly, as though it had never been about her at all. She understood, standing there with a bowl of good hot food she had not had to earn, or fear, that some of these people had already decided in their hearts that she was trouble that had come walking up out of the snow, and would leave blood behind it in the snow when it left. She was not wrong about them, but she was not entirely right about them either. She was learning that too, slowly, that people were rarely only one thing. Kale did not send her away. That was the second thing she learned, and it undid something inside her chest that 11 days of running had wound bowstring tight. She had been braced for it since she woke, braced for the reasonable king to do the reasonable thing, to weigh one strange southern Omega against the safety of his whole pack, and find her wanting to walk her back over the pass, as promised, and wash his hands of the danger she dragged to his gate. She had lived her whole life being found wanting when she was weighed against something someone valued more. She knew the shape of that morning by heart. It did not come. Instead, Kale simply folded the threat into the ordinary business of the day, the way a strong, deep river folds a fallen stone into itself and keeps on flowing. He gave her work, not because a king had any need of an Omega's hands, but because he had understood something about her, back in that bloody clearing, that she had not yet fully understood about herself, that she was a person who came quietly apart in idleness and knit herself back together in usefulness. That her hands had to be doing something, or her mind would turn on itself like a dog worrying a wound. He set the pack's healing stores in front of her, a long shelf of dusty jars and bundled dried things that nobody had properly tended in 3 years, not since Rosalind died, and he said, plainly, Ordner tells me half of this has gone to rot. And he can't tell which half. You knew a poacher's trap by feel. Maybe you know good moss from spoiled by feel too. And she did. Of course she did. By the end of the 3rd day she had that entire shelf set to rights, the fever bark separated cleanly, from the bleeding mosses, the still good jars divided, from the ones gone soft and dark with rot. A whole quiet, careful system reassembling itself under her clever certain fingers. It was the first work she had done in years that no one stood over, no one criticized, no one used as an excuse. She found she had almost forgotten that work could feel like that, like something you gave, rather than something extracted from you. And on the 4th day, the reckoning came, in the way such things always come, unannounced. The pack's oldest hunter, a grizzled man named Tor, came stumbling into the hall at midday, with his shoulder torn wide open to the bone by a cornered boar, the blood coming through his packed-on rags faster than his companions could keep up with it. And the man, who usually stitched such wounds, the closest thing Ashmore had to a proper healer, was 2 full valleys away, and half a day's hard ride from being any use to anyone. The hall filled with the particular helpless noise of strong people watching one of their own bleed, and not knowing what to do about it. Wren looked at the wound, and she did not flinch, and she did not faint, and she did not wait to be given permission by a single soul in that room. She crossed to the table where they'd laid him. She had the wound unwrapped, and her eyes on the true shape of the damage, before the men around her had finished arguing about who should ride for help. Boil water, she said, and her voice cut through the noise clean and flat, and to everyone's own quiet astonishment, they did it. Clean cloths, as many as you have. And bring me the jar of gray moss From the second shelf, the dry one, not the damp. Go. She threaded the needle by the firelight. She cleaned the great ragged tear with boiled water gone barely cool enough to bear. And then she closed it, stitch by small even stitch, her hands steady as still water, while the big hunter gripped the edge of the table and swore words that would have curled the bark off a tree, and when she had it closed she packed it firm. With the very gray moss she had sorted off that shelf 3 days before, and she bound it clean, and the bleeding, which had been going to kill him, stopped. The hall was very, very quiet when she straightened up and finally lifted her eyes from her work. She found them all watching her. The murmurers, the doubters, the ones who had decided, over their morning porridge, that she was nothing but trouble walking on 2 legs. And she watched the slow arithmetic begin to change behind their eyes, watched them add up the sorted shelf, and the closed shoulder, and the steady hands, and the flat, clear voice that had cut through their panic and come out, one by one, with a different sum than the one they'd started the day with. Not all of them. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to matter. Cale stood in the doorway, with his arms folded across his chest, and there was a look on his weathered face that she was just beginning to be able to read, and it was not surprise. It was the quiet, grim, almost pained look of a man watching a thing he had suspected from the first be proven true in front of witnesses. You shouldn't be this good at that, he said quietly, later, when Tor had been carried off to sleep and the hall had emptied of everyone but the 2 of them and the settling fire. Wren was wiping the blood from her hands on a clean rag. You keep telling me I shouldn't be things, she said, without looking up. I'm beginning to think you just enjoy being wrong about me. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a real smile she had yet seen from him, and it traveled a little further across his face than the last one had. The days after that took on a shape. There is a particular slow magic in shared work that no one who has not lived inside it will ever quite believe, and it was this quiet magic, and not any grand romantic gesture, that began to grow between them, silent and gradual, as frost feathering across a cold window pane overnight. They did not court. Neither of them had the first idea in the world how to do such a thing, and both of them, for their own hard-earned reasons, had learned to be wary of the very word. But they cooked at the same fire, morning and evening, and somewhere in the second week, she learned to pass him the ladle a half-second before he reached for it, and he learned, without a word, to shift the heavy iron pot to the left side of the stove, the side she favored. None of it was ever spoken aloud. All of it was understood. It was a language built entirely out of small considerations, and it was the first language Wren had ever been fluent in that did not also, somewhere, contain a threat. In the long blue evenings, he took her down to the corral below the hall, where 3 horses lived out their opinions on the world. There was Sister, the patient old bay mare, who had carried Wren in from the snow. There was a rangy ancient gelding who mostly wished to be left alone with his hay. And there was a paint gelding of such profound, committed, bottomless contrariness that Cale had long ago given up on any other name for him and simply called him Contrary, on the entirely reasonable grounds, he explained, that there was no earthly point in pretending otherwise. You can ride any of them, he told her, that first evening at the fence. Whenever you want. Wherever you want. That's not conditional on anything. There it was again. Not conditional on anything. She had begun to understand that he said it on purpose, that he had noticed, with those patient watching eyes, the way her whole body still braced instinctively for the hook hidden inside every kindness, and that he was, gently and deliberately, and without ever once naming it, teaching her that some sentences in the world simply did not have a hook in them. That an offer could be only an offer. It was, she thought, perhaps the single most radical thing anyone had ever tried to teach her. She rode Sister at first. And then, because she was who she was and had always been, she began spending her evenings at the far fence with Contrary, the horse nobody could get near, the one who bit and balked and pinned his ears and turned his tail on the entire human race, with the pure conviction of long practice. She did not push him. She did not try to break him to her will, the way she had watched men break horses her whole life. She simply came every evening and stood at his fence and talked her low gentle nonsense at him and asked absolutely nothing of him at all. It took 11 days. She noticed the number, and she did not say a word about it to anyone, but she noticed. 11 days, exactly, before the paint gelding crossed the width of the corral entirely of his own free and contrary accord, and put his big ridiculous head over the top rail and let her lay a hand along the flat of his cheek. Cale watched it happen from the porch of the hall in the last of the light. He hasn't done that, he said, and his voice was strange. Not for anyone. Not once in 3 years. He was only ever waiting to be asked instead of told, Wren said quietly, scratching along the gelding's jaw, while he leaned his great weight into her hand and sighed. That's all. It isn't complicated, really. People just get it backwards. They think the trust comes after you make something obey. It's the other way around. She felt Cale go still behind her, up on the porch, that particular deep stillness she was learning to recognize, the one that came over him when she had said something true, without at all meaning to say something true. She did not turn around to look at him, but she felt the stillness, and she understood, with a small quiet shock, that it no longer frightened her in the least. She was beginning to understand a great many things she was not yet ready to say out loud. The trouble, when it finally came, wore a beautiful face. Trouble very often does. It would not be nearly so effective otherwise. Her name was Vexia, and she arrived at the gates of Ashmore a little over 3 weeks after Wren, at the head of a small mounted escort, on a tall gray horse worth more than the entire Ashmore corral put together. She was a highborn alpha female out of one of the great old northern packs, and she was, in nearly every particular, everything that Wren was not, tall and gleaming and powerful, wrapped head to foot in the kind of unshakable certainty that a lifetime of money and rank and never once being underestimated builds into the very bones of a person. She had come, she announced grandly in the hall, on behalf of the Northern Alliance, to discuss the delicate matter of the Southern Lord's threat against Ashmore's peace. But Wren watched the way Vexia's eyes found Cale across the crowded hall, the very first moment she entered it, the way they fixed on him, and warmed and sharpened all at once, and she understood, in the space of a single heartbeat, that the alliance was the errand, and the man was the whole entire reason. Vexia had wanted Cale Thorne for years. Anyone with working eyes could see it plainly. And she had ridden north this time fully expecting to find a grieving, hardened king still rattling around alone in his too large empty hall, ripe at last, after 3 long years, to be comforted and claimed. Instead, she had found a half-starved Southern Omega sorting his healing stores and passing him the ladle before he reached for it, and being obeyed by his hunters and befriended by his impossible horse, moving through his hall, as though some part of her had always belonged in it. And something behind Vexia's beautiful face went cold and sharp and very quietly calculating. She was not cruel all at once. The truly dangerous ones never are. Cruelty spent too soon is merely temper, and temper can be dismissed. Vexia was gracious for 2 entire days. Charming. Warm to Wren, even, in a bright glancing way that never quite reached her eyes. And then at supper on the 3rd night, in front of the whole gathered hall, she set down her cup with a small deliberate click, and she turned to Wren with a smile like the honed edge of a good knife. I confess, Vexia said, her voice pleasant as the first warm day of spring, pitched to carry, I simply don't understand it. A king of the north. Old blood, old lands, a name that means something in every hall, from here to the sea. And he takes in a runaway Omega, with another man's marks still fading on her face. She let her lovely eyes travel slowly, deliberately, over Wren, the healing bruise, the thin frame, the plain worn dress, the whole plainness of her, and she let the entire hall travel along, that path with her, made them all look. Tell me, little southern thing, what is it, exactly, that you do here? Besides eat a king's bread and warm a dead woman's chair and bring a king's enemies riding to his gate. The hall went silent. Every face turned, and Wren felt the old heat climb up the back of her neck. The old shame. The old instinct, worn smooth as a river stone by 22 years of use, to make herself smaller and smaller and quieter until the danger simply lost interest and moved on. She had spent her entire life surviving exactly this moment, in 1,000 different rooms, by folding herself down into nothing. She opened her mouth to deflect, to shrink, to apologize, to survive the only way she had ever known how, and Cale Thorne stood up from the table. He did not raise his voice. That was the thing about him she would never, as long as she lived, get over. He never once had to raise his voice. She sorted stores 3 grown men left standing in this hall to rot, he said, and each word came down separate and deliberate, like a stone set, with care into a wall that would still be standing in 100 years. She closed Tor's shoulder, with her own 2 hands, when the man, who does it was half a day's ride gone, and Tor is sleeping tonight instead of buried, because of it. She got her hands on contrary in 11 days. He let that particular fact hang in the silence a moment, for the several people in that hall who understood exactly what it meant. A thing I could not do in 3 years of trying. He let all of it settle. And then, quieter, dropping into a low register that raised the fine hairs on Ren's arms clear to the shoulder, and she is under my protection. In my hall, at my fire and my table. Say one more word to her in the tone you just used, Vexia, and you will say the word after it on the far side of my gate. Alliance or no alliance. Nobody in the entire hall drew breath. Vexia's beautiful face did something complicated and quick. She was far too well-bred to gape, too practiced to let it show for more than an instant, but the certainty cracked, just for that instant, right down the middle. And Ren, who had spent a lifetime learning to read exactly this, exactly the flicker of the true thing behind the composed face, saw the fury come pouring silently in behind the crack. Cold, patient. And she understood with a small cold certainty of her own, now entirely permanent. She had made an enemy tonight. She understood that clearly. But she also understood, sitting there in that suddenly, ringingly silent hall, with her heart slamming hard against her ribs, something far larger and far stranger than the enemy. For the first time in her entire life, a powerful person had stood up, in a crowded room, in front of everyone, and put their own weight, and their own standing squarely between Ren Holloway and harm. And they had done it. This was the part that went through her like the first genuinely warm day at the tail of a killing winter, the part she would turn, over and over for the rest of her life, not because she was weak and pitiable and needed rescuing, but because she was worth defending. The distinction was everything. It was the whole world remade. She had not known until that exact moment, sitting frozen at a stranger king's table, just how starved every cell of her body had been for it. She did not thank him. Some things are simply too large to thank a person for. The thanks would only make them smaller. She only met his storm gray eyes across the length of the hall, once, and held them, and let him see that she had understood exactly what he had done, and exactly what it might cost him, and that she would carry the knowing of it carefully for as long as she lived. He gave her the smallest nod in the world, barely a movement at all. And he sat back down and picked up his cup, and the hall slowly, warily, began to breathe again. It should have been a clean triumph. And in a way, it was. But triumphs, Ren was learning, have a particular way of shaking other things loose in their passing. That night, she could not sleep. The hall had emptied and gone dark and cold, the great fire banked down to a low sullen bed of orange embers, and Ren sat awake on the edge of her narrow bed turning the small iron key, over and over between her fingers, and she could not for the life of her name the thing that was keeping her awake. It was not fear. She had learned the exact taste of fierce sleeplessness across a lifetime, and this was not it. This was something warmer and far more dangerous, and she did not have a name for it because she had never once before been allowed to feel it. She rose at last and went out into the dark main hall for water, moving quiet as habit made her, in her stocking feet across the cold flags. And she found that she was not alone. Cale sat by the dying fire, not sleeping either. A cup of something long gone cold sat forgotten in his big hand, and he was gazing down into the low red coals the way men gaze into fires when what they are truly looking at is not the fire at all, but something years and years behind them. She should have gone quietly back to her room. She knew that. It was the safe thing, the sensible thing, the thing that kept the boundary he had so carefully built for her intact. She crossed the dark hall and sat down beside him on the warm stone of the hearth instead. For a long while neither of them said anything at all. The fire ticked and settled. The wind moved against the old stone of the walls with a sound like something breathing. And then, because the dark makes people brave, or foolish, or honest, she was never afterward entirely sure which, or whether in the end there was any real difference between the three. Wren asked him, softly, about Rosalind. And he told her. Not the polished version. Not the version worn smooth by 3 years of telling. The true one, the rough one, the mate he had buried 3.5 years past, the fever that had come roaring back to finish its work after everyone, Rosalind most stubbornly of all, had sworn it beaten. The particular private hell of a strong man, a man whose whole life had been built on being strong enough, learning that strength was the one single thing in all the world that could not save the one person he would have given anything to keep. He did not perform his grief for her. He did not dress it up to move her. He simply set it down there on the hearth between them, plain and heavy and true, the way he had once set down that same fact in a careful formal letter, like a thing she was owed the knowing of, on the quiet, unspoken theory that she was strong enough to be trusted to bear the weight of it. She would have had opinions about you, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved again, tugged this time by something warmer than grief. Strong ones. Loud ones. She had opinions about everything under the sky. It was one of her very best qualities, and it drove me half to madness, and I would give a great deal to be driven mad by it just once more. Good opinions or bad? Wren asked. Both. All at once, most likely, and she'd have argued both sides, with you until dawn, and enjoyed every minute. He looked into the coals. She'd have liked that you got contrary to come to the fence. She'd have been absolutely insufferable about it. 3 years, Cale, 3 years you spent bribing that animal with apples, and a half-frozen southern slip of a thing does it in under a fortnight by doing nothing at all. He shook his head slowly, and the smile stayed. And she'd have been right. I'd have deserved every word of it. Wren laughed. A real one, surprised straight out of her, sudden and bright, and entirely without her permission, the first true laugh to leave her body in longer than she could clearly remember. And Cale turned his head and looked at her, when she did it, looked at her laughing there in the low red firelight in a way that made the breath catch clean in her throat and the laugh die soft on her lips. And all at once the small careful distance between them on the hearth had a weight to it. A warmth. A temperature that had not been there a moment before. He reached up, slowly, so slowly, giving her every moment in the wide world to draw back, to turn away, to end it, and he tucked a loose strand of dark hair back from the fading bruise beneath her eye. His hand was enormous, and it was unbelievably gentle, and it hovered, for one long, impossible heartbeat, exactly 1 inch from the curve of her face. Neither of them moved. She could feel the heat coming off his skin. She could smell the cedar and the cold, clean stone that her whole treacherous body had somehow already learned to lean toward like a plant leaning after the sun. Every part of her that had ever, in 22 guarded years, wanted anything at all was leaning now, openly, toward him, and his storm-gray eyes had gone dark, and his gaze dropped once to her mouth, and she thought, wild and clear, this is happening. This is finally happening when I kiss you, Cale said, very low, his voice gone rough as gravel dragged over the words, I am not going to stop. Not at a kiss. Not partway. Not at all. He drew in a breath. So I am not going to start it tonight. Not here in the dark when you're worn thin from grieving my grief with me, when you're still running from something 1,000 miles behind you, when you don't yet fully know your own mind or your own heart. He drew his hand back, slowly, and she could see it plainly on his face, the single hardest thing she had ever watched a man make himself do. You'll know when you know it. And when you do, you'll come and find me and tell me, so in the daylight, with your eyes wide open and nothing chasing you. And then, Wren Holloway, and there it was, the almost smile, gone soft and dangerous all at once, then we will see about the rest of it. And he stood, and he banked the last of the fire with the iron, and he left her sitting alone there on the warm hearth, with her heart slamming against her ribs, and her whole body aching toward the cold, empty space, where the warmth of him had just been. She did not sleep at all that night, but it was, for the very first time in her life, the good kind of sleepless. The next morning she went into the north storeroom to fetch down a sack of dried apples for the day's cooking, and she found the drawer. It was in an old dresser shoved back into the far corner and half forgotten, one of Rosalind's things, one of the pieces nobody in 3 years had quite found the heart to clear out and carry away. The bottom drawer was locked, and the lock was small and old, and Wren Holloway had, by now, a great deal of hard-won experience with small old locks and the clever, patient hands it took to open them, and something she never afterward could name. Some cold breath at the back of her neck made her kneel down on the stone floor and work it open. Inside was a journal, not Rosalind's. This was older. Water stained along one edge, the leather of its cover cracked and darkened with age, and it had been carefully wrapped in a square of waxed oilcloth by hands that had badly wanted it to survive whatever was coming. Tucked under the binding cord was a folded note in a different hand entirely, an old servant's careful, laborious letters, and it said only this, kept safe 3 years, and carried a long way, for whoever comes after. Someone should know their names. Someone should say them out loud. Wren sat down slowly on the cold stone floor of the storeroom, in the thin gray light, from the single high window, and she opened it, and she began to read. The first pages were an ordinary young woman's ordinary life. A wedding described with shy hope. A great fine house somewhere far to the south. A husband written of at first with the careful, grateful optimism of a girl who has been told all her life how very fortunate she is, and is trying with all her heart to feel it. And then, page by slow page, entry by entry, Wren watched the hope begin to thin. Watched the husband's warmth be revealed, slowly, for a performance, with nothing at all living behind it. The doors that were found to lock only from the outside. The servants who saw everything that happened in that great house and were paid, very generously and very regularly, to see nothing at all. And then, creeping in around the edges of the entries, whispered another name. The one before me. A first wife. Dead at the foot of a grand staircase, in a house full of witnesses who had every one of them, somehow, been quietly interviewed and paid and sent far away. Her name was Ottilie, the journal said, in a hand that had begun, over the pages, to shake. No one in this house will say it anymore. I have come to understand that I am going to be the second name no one says. If you are reading this, whoever you are, whoever comes next into these rooms, then say our names out loud. Please, do not let him make us quiet the way he has made everyone else quiet. And then, in a different ink, pressed hard into the page, as though written in a great hurry and near dark. My name is Kasia. I am writing this in the dark because he does not permit me a light after sundown. If you have found this, then I did not run far enough, or I did not run soon enough, and it is too late for me now. So I am writing it for you instead. Run farther than I did. Run sooner. Do not believe the good letters. Do not believe the careful voice. And the man who did this, the man who buries his wives beneath staircases and fevers and pays every question in the world to look the other way, his name is Damaris Vale. Wren's hands went cold on the pages. Cold all the way through. She understood it, all at once, sitting there on the frozen stone floor in the thin gray light, understood it the way you understand a thing that has been standing in front of you the whole time. This was not a coincidence. It could not be. Rosalind had died of a fever, yes, but the servant, who had saved this journal, who had wrapped it in oilcloth and carried it a long way and pushed it into safe hands, had sent it here. To Ashmore. To Cale Thorne. 3 years ago, after Rosalind was already in the ground, into the very depths of a widowed king's grief as a warning. A warning that had gone unread, sliding unnoticed into a locked drawer among a dead woman's things, while the man it was meant for grieved too deep to sort through them. She understood that the man now riding north toward her, through the snow, was not a jilted suitor. Not a cheated buyer come to reclaim his coin. He was something with a pattern. Something patient and thorough, and old in its evil, that collected frightened young women the way other men collected coin, or land, and buried them under staircases and unnamed fevers, and paid the whole watching world to call it grief. And she understood, with a cold, flat certainty, that settled down into the very marrow of her bones, and did not ever, after leave, that if she went back, if Cale, to spare his pack a war it did not want, ever weakened and handed her south, she would become the third name that no one said. She was not going to be the third name. She got to her feet, and as she rose, in the thin highlight, the worn collar of her dress shifted at her shoulder, and she caught sight of her own reflection in the dark speckled glass of a cracked mirror leaning against the storeroom wall, and she stopped, entirely still. There, at the curve of her left shoulder, where she had carried it, unremarked, her entire life, and had somehow never once thought to truly question. A mark she had always been told, on the rare occasions anyone remarked on it at all, was simply a birthmark. A pale silver tracing, fine and intricate as frost ferns spreading across a winter windowpane, in the shape of something she had no name for, and had never seen anywhere else. She had covered it all her life. She had done it without ever being told to, without ever deciding to. She had simply always known, the deep wordless way a child knows things in a house, where knowledge is dangerous, that it was safer if no one ever saw it. That it was a thing to keep hidden, a thing to keep small, a thing to keep quiet. But now, in the gray light of the cold storeroom, with the murdered woman's journal still open in her hand, and her whole body still quietly humming from a night beside a fire, the mark was doing something it had never once done before in all her 22 years. It was glowing, faintly, silver, alive. Wren stared at it in the cracked and speckled glass, and somewhere far down beneath her breastbone, the thing that had opened one eye in the bloody snow, when her palm first touched a wounded king's fur, slowly, deliberately, opened the other. She did not understand it. Not yet. Not the half of it. She only knew, standing there, with a bone-deep certainty she had never felt about anything in her life, that she was not what she had been told she was. That useless Omega had been a story, a careful, useful, deliberate story that someone, somewhere, a long time ago, had needed her to believe about herself. That there was something in her very blood, that the silver collar, and the signed contract, and her father's heavy hands, and a lifetime of murmured cruelty, had all, each in their own way, without ever fully understanding what they were doing, been built and aimed to keep sealed and small and quiet. She was done being quiet. She was so entirely, finally done. She found Cale in the corral at midday, in the pale cold sun, and she did not soften a single word of it. "He is not coming to reclaim a bride," she said, and she held the oilcloth-wrapped journal out to him across the fence rail. "He is coming to bury one. There were two before me, Cale. Audley. Kasha. He killed them both, and he paid the entire world to look the other way, while he did it, and someone who couldn't stomach the silence saved the proof, and sent it here, to your hall, 3 years ago. And it has been sitting locked in a drawer among Rosalind's things under the whole weight of your grief, this entire time." Cale took the journal from her hand. She stood and watched him read it, watched the great terrible stillness come down over him, the dangerous banked stillness she had once flinched from, and this time it did not frighten her in the smallest degree. This time it did not frighten her because, for the very first time, it was standing squarely on the same side of the line that she was. When he finished, he was quiet for a long, long moment. His jaw worked once. 3 years, he said finally, very low. "It's been under this roof for 3 years. Something moved across his face then, that she recognized instantly and utterly, because she had lived her whole life inside the shape of it, the specific, particular, bottomless grief of the thing you could have saved, if only you had known where to look for it. If I'd cleared out that room, if I'd had the strength to go through her things instead of locking the door on them. Rosalind's fever, I never once thought to ask whether it was truly only a fever, whether he might have already reached this far north, whether. You couldn't have known, Wren said. And then, because it was true, and because she could see he needed it the way a drowning man needs air, you went into the burning barn after the horses, Kale. You always go in. You told me so yourself, in 100 small ways, without ever once saying it. You just didn't know this particular one was burning. There's no sin in that. The sin was his. He looked at her, and something passed between the two of them across that cold fence rail that had no name and needed none. Then he said the thing she had been braced against since she'd risen from the storeroom floor, the thing that every powerful person in her whole life had, sooner or later, always eventually said to her. He'll bring the old law with him. A father's signed and sealed contract. And half the packs in the Northern Alliance will stand up and say I'm harboring a runaway bride and starting a war over the pack's peace and all of it over one Southern Omega they've never met. He set his jaw hard. Vexia will say it loudest of anyone in the North. And there are men, good men, even careful men, who will come to me tonight and tell me that the simple thing, the safe thing, the sensible thing for everyone is to send you south and keep the peace. The old cold fear rose up hard in Wren's throat. She waited, braced, for the hook to show itself at last. She waited for him to become, in the end, the thing that all of them in the end became. Let them say it, Kale said. And he handed the journal back to her, pressed it back, into her own two hands, let her keep it, let it stay hers to carry, and hers to decide the use of, the way he had let everything, from the very first hour, stay her own choice. And he looked at her across the sunlit corral, with those storm-gray eyes, and there was nothing careful left in them at all now. Nothing guarded. Nothing held back in reserve. I don't buy peace with people, he said. I did that once. I let a house go quiet to keep from making noise, and I lost 3 years to the silence of it, and Rosalind would have had a great many loud opinions about that too, and every one of them would have been right. I am not paying that price again, not for anyone. You are not currency, Wren Holloway. Not to your father, who spent you like a coin. Not to that man riding up out of the south. And not to me. If Damaris Vale wants you, then he comes through this pack to get you. And he comes through me. And he is going to learn, on my ground, exactly why the cold king out past the pass earned every last hard story they ever told about him. Wren stood there in the cold corral, with a murdered woman's journal clasped against her chest, and a mark like frozen silver fire waking slowly on her shoulder beneath the worn cloth of her dress, and a man standing in front of her, who had just, plainly, in the broad clean daylight, with his eyes wide open, told her that he would burn to the ground before he handed her over. She thought of Kasha, riding in the dark, with no light after sundown. Run farther than I did. She had run far enough. She had run 11 days and a whole lifetime, all the way to the cold far edge of the world, and she had found, at the end of it, the one single place in all of it where she could finally stop. I'm done running, she said. And her voice did not shake, and this time it was not, because she had practiced it in the dark, until it wouldn't. This time it was, because she meant it, all the way down to the floor of herself. You told me the room was mine. You told me I could choose. So I'm choosing. I'm choosing to stay. And I am choosing to be standing right here on my own 2 feet, on my own ground, when he comes. Kale looked at her for a long moment. Something fierce and proud and unspeakably tender moved behind his eyes. Then he turned toward the hall, and he raised his voice, truly raised it, for the first time since she had known him, and it carried out across the whole White Valley like the long low note of a war horn. Bran, he called. Send riders. I want the Alliance witnesses here, all of them, every pack that'll answer. And send word to Vexia too, I want her here most of all. A grim thing came into his weathered face that was almost a smile. If we are going to have this out, then we are going to have it out in the open, in front of every last witness the North can send. Let all of them see with their own eyes, exactly who is protecting what. Down at the far fence, Contrary lifted his big head and watched the two of them standing there together, his ears pricked sharply forward, judging as ever and present as ever and, for the first time in 3 long years, unmistakably, grudgingly, approving. Far to the south, on a hard road, through the snow, a patient man was already riding north. And on Wren Holloway's shoulder, beneath the worn cloth of a borrowed dress, something ancient and sealed, and no longer in the least willing to stay small and quiet, burned low and silver and steady, waiting, only waiting now. For the one moment it had been kept asleep her whole life to finally wake. But that is the last part of the story. Part 3. He came on the 4th morning, and he came the way such men always come, unhurried and certain and utterly at his ease, as though his arriving were itself the event, and the rest of the standing world merely the place it had chosen to happen in. Wren heard the horses long before she saw them. She was already standing on the porch of the great hall, where she had planted herself at first gray light, and could not have been moved by anything short of an act of God, and the sound came drifting up the west road at a slow measured pace, the pace of a man who has decided, somewhere long ago, that he simply cannot be refused, and who has never once in the whole course of his life been proven wrong about it. Then Lord Damaris Vale rode into the yard of Ashmore, and Wren saw him in the full daylight for the first time, since the morning her own father had sold her, and he was exactly as she remembered him. That was the terrible part. That was always the terrible part with men like Damaris. They do not change themselves to suit their surroundings. They expect the surroundings to change to suit them. The fine dark coat, immaculate against the snow. The distinguished silver at his temples. The smooth, handsome, entirely unreadable face that held its arranged expression the way a carved mask holds an expression, every genuinely human thing that ought to have lived behind it carefully subtracted out and thrown away long ago, leaving behind only the flawless performance of a feeling standing in the empty place, where the feeling itself should have been. Behind him rode 6 of his people, hard-faced, well-armed, watchful, and behind them, at a careful and deliberate distance, came the northern witnesses that Cale had summoned across the past 3 days, Elder Bran on his patient old horse, the grave representatives of half the packs of the Alliance and Vexia, riding gleaming and cold and separate, who had come all this way to watch the cold king of Ashmore finally, at long last, do the sensible thing and hand the troublesome little southerner back, where she so obviously belonged. Damaris looked at the hall. He looked at Cale, standing motionless in the center of the yard, still as carved stone. And then he looked at Wren, up on the porch, and the look held on her one single beat too long, one beat in, which the mask slipped, and something underneath it counted her, the way a man counts coin he believes he has already spent, before his face smoothly rearranged itself into an expression meant to resemble warmth. Wren, he said. Her own name, in his mouth, felt exactly like a hand closing slowly around her jaw. She had spent 11 days and an entire lifetime running from the particular sound of her name in the mouths of men who believed they owned it. She did not move. She did not fold. She did not make herself smaller. She had folded under this exact voice, this exact ownership, her whole life long, and she was done. All the way done. Lord Vale, she said. Level. Clear. 2 words that gave him nothing. He dismounted with the fluid, unhurried ease of a man who has never once in his life been made to feel that his own body might be in any danger. He spread his gloved hands wide, but not the way Cale spread his hands, open and empty and offered. Damaris spread his the way a man opens his arms to display a possession he already fully believes belongs to him. You have led me on quite a chase, child. Pleasant. Almost fond. Almost, very nearly warm. 11 days in that. Your poor father is quite beside himself with worry, you know. And you've imposed so terribly on the hospitality of, he turned the smooth weight of his gaze onto Cale, the local lord here. I'll take her off your hands, Thorn, and trouble you no further. I am, whatever you may have heard, a reasonable man. Whatever she's cost you in bread and bother, I will see it repaid to you, generously. There is truly no need for any of this to become difficult for anyone. Cale Thorne looked at him the way a mountain looks at weather passing across its face. She's not yours to take, he said. Damaris's smile held its shape, but something shifted behind the eyes. I have a contract, signed by her own father, witnessed and sealed in the proper form. And the old law of the Pax is really very clear on the matter of a father's lawful arrangement for an unmated daughter. He let his gaze drift, unhurried, across the assembled witnesses, across Bran, letting them all hear it, letting the weight of law and custom do the work his own hands preferred not to. I had so hoped to spare everyone the embarrassment of the particulars. But if the cold king of the North truly wishes to start a war over a single runaway Omega, well, the whole of the North will at least want it known that he was warned first and chose it anyway. It was, Ren had to grant him, beautifully done. She could see the machinery of it working even as she hated it. In 3 smooth sentences, he had turned the whole yard against her, made her the cause of a war, made Cale the reckless fool, who would burn the North down, over a woman not worth the burning. She watched the Alliance faces shift and cloud. She saw the small, satisfied curve at the corner of Vexia's mouth. And then Elder Bran urged his old horse a single step forward and cleared his throat and spoke. The contract has no standing. His voice was dry and flat and absolutely certain, the voice of a man who had kept the law of the North for 30 unbroken years and did not, at his age, much care whose feelings the truth happened to bruise on its way out. A daughter of age is not a debt. She is not chattel to be signed across a table. The old law you are, so carefully quoting, Lord Vale, was struck down and struck out in every pack of this alliance more than 2 decades ago, a fact exceedingly well known to any man who claims, as you just did, to respect that law. So, he let it settle, over the silent yard like snow. What her father sold you, he did not own. What you paid your coin for was air and winter wind. There is no war here to be started. There is only a man who bought a thing that was never anyone's to sell, riding a very long way north to collect it from people who owe him precisely nothing. The yard went very, very quiet. And Damaris Vale's smooth, handsome, unreadable face developed a single hairline crack. Just one. Barely visible. The kind of crack that only ever appears when a man who has arranged every last detail of the world to his liking discovers, all at once, one small detail that he did not arrange. And Ren Holloway understood, standing there on the porch, that this was the moment. Not later. Not once it was safer. Not once someone else had gone first. Now, while every witness the North could send stood watching, while the crack in him stood open, now, or she would carry the silence of it inside her for the rest of her life, exactly the way poor Kasha had carried it down, into the dark, with no light after sundown. She came down off the porch. She came down the 2 worn steps and out across the frozen yard, past Cale, past the 6 hard-faced armed men who tracked her with their eyes, and she stopped 6 feet from Lord Damaris Vale, and she looked up directly into his face, which she had never once, in the whole of her life, been able to do. She had never before had the ground beneath her own feet to do it with. She had it now. Oddly, she said. The hairline crack in his face widened by a single degree. Kasha, she said. And there it was, at last, the thing that lived behind the mask, surfacing for one unguarded instant into the cold morning light. Something flat and cold and reptile still. The true and final face of Damaris Vale, looking out at her through the holes of the arranged one. I know their names, Ren said. And her voice carried, clear and steady and unhurried, out across the whole silent frozen yard, into every listening ear. The voice of a woman who had practiced steadiness alone in the dark for years and years, and had at last arrived somewhere she no longer needed the practice. Oddly, dead at the foot of a grand staircase, in a house full of servants, every one of whom was quietly interviewed and paid and sent far away. Kasha. Dead of an illness that no physician was ever permitted to name, that took her fast and left behind no record any honest man could read. She lifted the journal then, up where they could all see it. Cash's journal, in its worn oilcloth, carried 3 years and a long hard way to arrive at exactly this yard, on exactly this morning. I know how they died, because one of them found the courage to write it down. In the dark, with no light, because he did not permit her one. For whoever came next. She opened it, and into the frozen, breathless morning air, she read aloud the dead woman's own words, and every living witness in that yard heard a murdered woman speak from beyond her unmarked grave. Say our names out loud. Do not let him make us quiet. The Alliance faces had gone gray and stricken. Vexia's small satisfied smile was entirely, wholly gone. Even Damaris's own 6 hard-faced men had shifted, where they stood, uneasy in their saddles now, and would no longer quite meet one another's eyes. You are making, Damaris said, and his voice had changed, the honey stripped clean out of it now, leaving something thinner and colder and far older underneath, extraordinarily dangerous accusations. Child, I'm reading aloud from a dead woman's diary, Wren said. The danger in this yard is all yours. And that was the moment Damaris Vale stopped pretending. It happened fast. She felt it, before her mind could name it. The very air of the yard changed, thickened, went heavy and dense, as deep cold water pressing in on every side. He drew himself up to his full height, and he unleashed the one weapon that a powerful alpha never has to explain or account for to anyone: his will, his dominance. The raw crushing force of it rolled off of him and slammed out across the frozen yard, and it was aimed, with vicious precision at her, at the small southern Omega, who had dared to stand on open ground and say the forbidden names out loud in front of witnesses. And it struck Wren like a physical wave, like the whole weight of the sea, and it drove her down to her knees. The watching yard gasped as one. Her body folded, without her permission, the old, deep, bred an animal response of a low creature to a high one, the ancient thing wired, into the very blood of her kind, made to force the Omega down, to make her small, to make her kneel, to make her quiet. Her knees struck the frozen dirt. The pressure came crushing down on the back of her bowed neck like an enormous invisible hand, forcing her head toward the ground. Across the yard she heard Kale move, heard the terrible snarl tear its way up out of a human throat, heard the 6 armed men shift all at once to meet him. If he charged, kneel, Damaris said. He was standing over her now, looking down at her bent neck, and his voice was the voice from every worst night of her whole life. That is all you are, girl. That is all you were ever made to be. Low, small, quiet. Kneel and be quiet, and I will be merciful with you, which I promise you is a great deal more than the other 2 were ever given. And Wren Holloway, down on her knees in the frozen yard of Ashmore, with the entire watching north, as her witness, felt the thing beneath her breastbone, the thing that had opened one eye in the bloody snow, and its second in the cold storeroom, finally, fully, at long and terrible last, come all the way awake. Because here is what Damaris Vale did not know. Here is the thing her father had never known, the thing the silver collar, and the signed contract, and every heavy hand that had ever tried to make her small had been built and aimed to keep sealed, without a single one of them ever truly understanding what it was they were straining so hard to hold down. She was not low. She had never once been low. The mark on her shoulder caught fire. Not warm fire. Silver and cold and unspeakably ancient, blazing up all at once through the worn cloth of her dress and throwing a hard, clean light across the whole yard the like of, which not one soul standing there had ever seen in their lives. The crushing pressure of his dominance hit that light and broke against it, shattered against it like a storm-driven wave shattering against a cliff that had been standing exactly where it stood since long, long before the sea ever learned its name. Wren felt the seal give way inside her. She felt something that had been folded down small and held quiet the entire length of her life unfold all at once to its true, its whole, its enormous size, and she lifted her bowed head. Her eyes had changed. They would tell her so after. They had gone from their plain and ordinary brown to a pale, blazing, depthless silver, the exact silver of the mark, the silver of an old and sovereign blood that the world had long ago taught itself to forget it had ever needed to fear. She got up. Damaris's dominance was still pouring off of him, still crashing and crashing against her, and now it did nothing at all. Nothing. She rose to her feet directly up, into the full force of it the way a person rises and stands up into hard rain. She got her feet under her, and she stood, straight and tall, in the very center of the howling storm of his will, and she watched the mask come off his face for the last time, and she watched something come into the space behind it that she had never once seen there before. Real fear. Genuine, human, animal fear, the very first honest thing she had ever seen Damaris Vale feel. "That is not possible," he whispered. He had gone the color of ash. "You are an Omega. You are nothing." "Yes," said Wren Holloway. "That is exactly what everyone always kept telling me." And she let go, at last, of the thing she had been holding sealed and small and quiet inside her every single day of her life. She never afterward had the words for what she became in that yard. The witnesses would argue over it for years, around 100 winter fires, a wolf, they would all agree, and yet the word was somehow wrong, too small, a wolf the pale silver white of moonlight on frost, larger by far than any alpha standing in the north. And older looking somehow, wrong in the way of a thing that had stepped whole and living out of a time before any pack had thought to keep its records. Ancient blood. Sovereign blood. The old, old kind that the winter stories said had been sealed away and scattered and hunted and lost to the world an age ago. The kind that a patient, thorough collector of quiet, frightened young women had, all unknowing, purchased for himself for the paltry price of a 7-year debt. She rose over Damaris Vale, silver and vast and terrible, and his 6 hard-faced armed men took one single look at her and did not draw their weapons, because there are things the animal body understands long before the thinking mind can catch up to them. And every creature standing in that frozen yard understood, all at once and all the way down, that the small quiet Omega had never once, from the very beginning, been the small one. And Kale was beside her. Not in front of her. Beside her. He had shifted too, the great black wolf, with the old scar along his muzzle, and he stood at her silver shoulder, not to shield her, because she plainly no longer had any need on this earth of shielding, but simply because that was where he had decided, freely and finally, to stand. In the daylight, with his eyes wide open, for the whole of whatever time the two of them were given, Damaris ran. Of course he ran. Men like that always run, in the very end, the moment the thing they were so certain was small turns out to be the largest and oldest thing in the yard. He wheeled his expensive horse hard about and drove it for the West Road, and he did not get far. Because Elder Brand's people had already, quietly, closed the road behind him. Because the Alliance witnesses had stood in that yard and heard a murdered woman speak her own name, and had not one shred of interest left in protecting the man who had spent his whole life making women like her quiet. Because there was, quite simply, nowhere left in all the north for Damaris Vale to run to. They took him alive. Wren made certain of that, came back into her own skin enough to make certain of it. A dead man is a story that ends. The earth closes over him and the questions close with it. But a living man, tried in the open, before the whole gathered alliance, with a murdered woman's own written words read aloud, into the permanent record, that is a reckoning that does not end. That is a reckoning that lasts. Audley's name and Cash's name went into the law of the North that day, spoken aloud before witnesses, entered where no amount of a patient man's coin could ever again pay them quiet. Damaris Vale was stripped of his lands, and his title, and his liberty, and sent south under guard to answer at last, for 2 women buried in silence, and for one attempted third, who had refused to stay quiet before a north that would never again agree to look away. And Vexia, who had ridden all this way north to watch a runaway handed meekly back, and had instead stood witness, while that runaway rose up, into the oldest living power any of them had ever laid eyes on, Vexia was escorted, cold and silent, and utterly finished, back to her own lands. Her long ambitions in the north were over, and everyone, including Vexia, knew it. She had staked everything she had on Ren Holloway being small. It was, in the very end, the identical wager that every single person in Ren's life had made, from her father to the last murmurer in the hall. It had always, from the very beginning, been the losing one. When it was over, when the yard had emptied, when the prisoner was away under guard, when the witnesses had scattered to carry the tale of it, into every pack and every hall the North possessed, Ren Holloway stood alone in the trampled, bloodied snow of Ashmore, back in her own ordinary body once more. Plain brown eyes, worn dress, the silver mark at her shoulder gone quiet and cool and dark again. And she found, standing there in the sudden stillness, that her two hands were shaking. Not from fear. Not this time. From the sheer, staggering size of the thing that had just moved through her and left her. Cale, a man again, crossed the yard to where she stood. He did not tell her that she had been magnificent, though she had been. He did not tell her that he had known all along what she truly was, though some part of him surely had, from that first touch in the snow. He simply came and stopped a careful pace in front of her and raised both of his hands, palms out, open, empty, exactly the way he had the very first time, in the bloody clearing on the mountain, when she was nothing to him but a half-frozen stranger, who flinched at any sudden movement. "You don't have to be that," he said, low and gentle. "Not with me. Not ever, unless you want to be. That, out there, that was for them. For the record. In here," and he tipped his dark head toward the hall behind him, toward the fire in it, toward the small quiet room, with a good bright lock on the inside of the door. "In here, you can just be Ren. If that's what you want. And that isn't conditional on one single thing either." And Ren Holloway looked at him. She looked at the king, who had shown her his open hands, before he had shown her anything else. Who had built her a lock, and given her its only key, before he had so much as learned the shape of her face. Who had stood up in a crowded hall, and set his own weight, and standing between her and harm, not because she was weak and needed saving, but because she was worth the defending. Who had told her, low by a dying fire, "When I kiss you I am not going to stop," and had then found in himself the terrible patience to wait, and wait, until her eyes were wide open, and it was broad daylight, and the choosing of it was fully, wholly, only her own. And she chose. "You told me," she said, and she took a single step toward him across the trampled snow, "that when I knew, I would come and find you and tell you so. In the daylight, with my eyes open." Another step. The last of the distance. "Well, it's daylight, Cale. My eyes are open. And I've come to tell you." Cale Thorne went very still. The good kind of still. The best kind she had ever seen from him. "Then finish it," he said, rough. "Say the rest." She did not finish it with words. She closed the last of the space between them, and she kissed him, there in the snow, in the hard, clean daylight, in front of God, and the whole silent watching north, and one paint gelding at the corral fence, who observed the entire proceeding, with his ears pricked sharply forward and, for the first time in the length of his contrary life, absolutely no objection whatsoever to lodge about any of it. And he kissed her back. And he did not stop. And it was exactly as he had promised her by that low fire, not part way. They were mated under the old gray cottonwood down by the creek in the spring, when the grass came shouldering up out of the cold ground the way spring always arrives at the far northern edge of the world, not gradually, not by careful degrees, but all at once, in a single morning, like a long-shut door being thrown wide open to the light. She wore a blue dress. Not a stolen one this time. One she had bought for herself, with her own earned coin, at a market 3 valleys down the road, because she had discovered, somewhere across that long healing winter, that she loved the particular feeling of choosing a thing and paying for it herself, and owing not one single soul in the world a thing for it after. Cale wore a white shirt gone soft and faintly yellow, with the years, genuinely and only his own, and she was fiercely glad that it was the real and worn one, and not something new bought to impress anybody, because they were long past all of that now. The two of them. Long past performing anything at all for anyone. Elder Brand said the old words over them, and the whole of Ashmore came to hear him say them, Tor, with his healed and knitted shoulder, standing near the front. The hunters. The old murmurers and doubters who had watched her stitch a wound and steady a panic and befriend an impossible horse and had changed their hard minds about her one by patient one across the winter. The neighbors, who had somewhere along the line simply decided that they were a part of this now and would not be argued back out of it. And Maeve came all the long way up, from the south, old and slow and fierce as ever, and she wept, without one shred of shame in the very front row. And afterwards she took Wren's face in both her weathered hands the exact same way she had on the black cold morning she had sent a bruised and frightened girl walking out alone into the snow. I told you, Maeve said, her old eyes shining wet. I told you that the day you finally understood the wanting was never the point would be the very day you stopped being anyone's to sell. She wiped her eyes with the back of one hand and laughed at herself. And would you look at you now, child? But then, you were never anyone's to sell, were you? Not once, not for a single day of your life. You were only ever, always, entirely your own. And in the north corner of the garden, where the clean morning light came in first and stayed longest, Wren had planted iris bulbs at the very end of that first hard winter, old ones, a rare and ancient variety. Silver-white with small hearts of gold at their centers, and in the spring they came up, and they opened, extravagant and brief and unreasonably beautiful, exactly the way things bloom that have been waiting patiently underground all through a long killing winter for precisely only this. She had planted them for Adelie and for Kasia. She stood looking at them on the bright morning of her mating, and she felt in her chest the particular deep fullness of a thing not ended, but completed, because there is a difference, and it matters, and the difference is that completed things leave something behind them in the world. She had kept the record alive. She had said the names out loud, in front of witnesses, where they could never again be paid quiet. And she had planted, with her own two calloused hands, something that would come up silver-white and living every single spring, from now on, whether anyone remembered to tend it or not, because she had wanted, more than anything, for the remembering to be built right into the living thing itself, rather than left to depend on the frailty of any one person's memory. Adelie and Kasia were not forgotten. They would never be made quiet again. Not so long as there was one single woman left in the north who would say their names to whoever would stand still long enough to listen, person to person, name to name, spring to spring, on and on, for as long as the irises came back up out of the ground. Later, long after the fiddles and the dancing, long after the last of the neighbors had wandered home in the dusk, after the endless northern evening had finally spent itself the way those evenings always do, pouring out everything it has left, into the enormous sky at the very end of the day, Wren sat on the porch steps beside her mate. Close. The particular kind of close that no longer required either of them to think about it or to adjust for it. She looked down at her own two hands in the fading light. They were not the hands of the girl who had come stumbling up out of the snow one hard winter morning. They were brown now by the sun and marked across the knuckles with the small honorable scars of real and useful work, gone rough and strong and calloused where all the soft uselessness used to be. They were, she thought, turning them over, the hands of someone who had built something. Someone who had made something true, with her own effort, that was going to last. I'm going to write to Maeve, she said, into the quiet. Every spring, when the irises come up. Just to tell her that they bloomed again. That they're still here. That we're all still here. Cale was quiet a moment beside her. Then, that's a good letter to write every year. Yes, she said. I think it is. The old cottonwood moved gently overhead in the last of the warm evening air, its new spring leaves catching the very final light of the day, and holding on to it for one long moment, before letting it go, exactly the way all living things hold, and then release. and then hold again, season upon season, not because anyone requires it of them, but simply because that is the thing being alive asks of you in the end. And they were equal to it. She was equal to it. She thought of Kasha, writing in the dark for whoever came next. She thought of Maeve, waiting on a frozen path at first light, with a packed satchel and her own small purse of coins hidden in the bottom of it. She thought of all the women, named and unnamed, remembered and forgotten, who had done the quiet, unwitnessed, unglamorous, endless work of building a path with their own hands that some other woman, someday, would get to walk. She was that other woman. She was the one who had gotten to walk it. And she was going to live loudly enough, for the rest of her life, for every last one of them, who never got the chance, not performance loud, not the empty kind of loud that is only noise dressed up as living, but the true kind. The kind that meant showing up, saying the names, planting the things that come back, telling the plain truth to men who are not used to hearing it, and standing on her own 2 feet, on her own hard-won ground, in a yard full of people who had every one of them been so entirely certain that she would kneel. She leaned her head against Cale's shoulder. He said nothing, and neither did she, for a long while, because the evening was doing what the northern evenings did, and there was nothing left that needed saying between them that had not already, somewhere along the way, been said. And then, because she simply could not help herself, because after all of it, after everything, the man could still tug that reluctant, almost smile up onto her mouth, without her ever once granting him permission, she nudged him gently with her shoulder and said, you know, that very first day, up in the clearing with the trap, when you told me you didn't bite, the almost smile she had long ago caught from him came and turned up the corner of his own mouth in the failing light. Darlin', Cale Thorne said, low and warm, looking out across the darkening garden too, where the silver irises glowed faintly, holding the very last of the light. I told you plain. I don't bite. He turned his head then, and he looked at her, and the storm-gray eyes had nothing careful left in them at all anymore, nothing guarded, nothing held back in reserve against some future hurt. There was only warmth in them now, only home. Unless, he said, you ask me to. And Wren Holloway laughed. A real one, full and bright and entirely unguarded, thrown up into the wide spring dark. The laugh of a woman who had once walked 11 days alone through a killing blizzard toward an address on a scrap of paper she was not at all sure she believed in, and who had found, waiting for her at the far cold edge of the whole world, the one single place she would never, for the rest of her days, have to run from again. She had been equal to it in the end. She had been equal to it for some time now. It had only ever taken getting all the way here to find it out.